Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're urgently unpacking a geopolitical scenario that literally rewrites the map of the modern world. We're looking at the harsh realities of a highly fractured NATO alliance, specifically the absolute truth about what happens if the United States completely walks away. And we're already seeing the cracks form and the dominoes begin to fall. Just think about the recent logistical nightmares we've seen. Spain closing its airspace to U.S. planes, Italy blocking American bombers from landing at Sigonella, and France outright banning U.S. resupply flights to Israel. The alliance has never looked this fractured in its entire history.
Okay, let's dive right into this. This quote serves as the major catalyst for our scenario today. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, we have to recognize that these words represent a very real, very tangible policy shift that is being openly discussed on the world stage right now. We're neutrally looking at this as our starting point, really setting the stage to explore exactly what happens to the entire architecture of global security if the United States actually executes this exit. So, if the US walks, what is actually left? That is the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? If the foundational pillar of the alliance for the last 7 decades is suddenly removed overnight, what is left standing? We have to urgently explore the cascading financial, military, and logistical blast radius of this decision. Because as you'll see, the reality of a Europe without American military backing is way more complicated than just subtracting US troop numbers from a spreadsheet.
Section 1. Europe's historic defense boom.
Now, ironically, from Washington's perspective, the initial data actually supports the argument for the U.S. stepping back. Just look at this number. In 2025, European NATO members hit a massive, record-breaking $600 billion in defense spending. That's up nearly 13% in real terms from the year prior. That is a staggering amount of money. This isn't just a routine budget increase, it marks a massive cultural and financial shift across an entire continent. After decades of leaning heavily on American security guarantees, the sheer prospect of the US leaving has forced Europe to finally open its wallet in a truly unprecedented way.
And this brilliantly illustrates the breakdown of that $600 billion. At the 2025 Hague Summit, members agreed to target 5% of their GDP on defense by 2035. Take Germany, for instance. They jumped to $107 billion. We were talking about a country that was constitutionally and culturally pacifist for 80 years after World War II, making a monumental pivot almost overnight. Then you have Poland, who is already nearing that 5% mark and quietly building one of the most formidable armies in Europe. But it's not a perfect picture, right? Spain opted out entirely, showing us that the commitment is definitely not uniform across the board. Still, if they stay on track, by 2030, European defense spending is projected to hit $850 billion. To put that in perspective, that roughly equals the baseline the US spends today.
Section 2. The hidden capability gaps.
Okay, so while that financial data looks incredibly optimistic on paper, we really have to look at the sobering reality of actual combat readiness. Money takes time to turn into capability, and frankly, Europe is facing some severely hidden capability gaps. On paper, European NATO members field about 2.1 million active troops. You've got France, Germany, the UK, Poland, and Italy each boasting well over 100,000 active personnel. Sounds like an impenetrable fortress, right? Well, in practice, headcount does not equal combat effectiveness. The European Defense Agency's own data reveals a huge variety of entirely incompatible weapon systems. We're talking different tanks, different artillery, different infantry vehicles that share absolutely zero parts and no maintenance protocols across borders. Trying to run joint operations with that kind of equipment isn't just difficult, it's a total logistical nightmare that raw troop numbers simply don't capture.
And the gaps get even deeper when we look at the specific, high-end mechanics of modern warfare. Europe is genuinely short on these 3 absolutely critical components. First, strategic airlift, the massive transport planes needed to move those armies around quickly. Second, air-to-air refueling tankers. These literally dictate how far your fighter jets can fly. And third, deep strike capabilities, to hit targets far behind enemy lines. The US Air Force has single-handedly provided these to every major NATO operation for 30 years. To plug these specific gaps by 2027 in a way that credibly deters Russia, analysts calculate it would require an immediate $270 billion annually, plus 300,000 more combat-ready troops. And they need that right now, not by 2035.
So the crucial point here is command and control, or C2. It's probably the least talked about gap, but it's easily the most dangerous. NATO's entire command structure essentially runs on American systems. The satellite comms, the surveillance, the targeting data, almost all of it is US-owned. Defense analysts politely describe Europe's current workarounds as, well, kludged together.
Now, it's true the US is handing over major headquarters like Joint Force Command Naples in Norfolk to European officers, but an incredibly stark reality remains. A command is only as good as the intelligence feeding it. And without the American backbone, those multinational forces simply cannot fight as a unified army under wartime pressure.
Section 3. The nuclear umbrella question.
For 77 years, peace on the European continent, which, by the way, is the longest period of peace in its modern history, relied heavily on one very simple threat. An attack on a NATO member meant risking American nuclear retaliation. If the US leaves, that historic guarantee vanishes. Poof. But Europe is scrambling to adapt. In March 2026, standing right in front of a nuclear submarine at the Élan-Naval base, French President Emmanuel Macron announced forward deterrence. This bold policy essentially extends France's nuclear umbrella to cover Germany, Belgium, and Poland. Furthermore, we are seeing the UK and France formalize joint nuclear submarine patrols, rapidly trying to construct a two-country European deterrent that didn't even exist a year ago. However, and this is key, Paris crucially maintains sole control over the nuclear trigger and all escalation decisions. Which brings us to this incredibly heavy, deeply practical question. Would France actually risk Paris getting hit to protect Warsaw or Tallinn? This instantly communicates the absolute cold logic of nuclear deterrence. It cuts right through the political rhetoric, doesn't it? A French president deciding whether to sacrifice their own capital to protect a neighbor is a very, very different geopolitical calculation than the one Washington has historically been willing to make. And look, it's not a criticism of France at all. It's simply why a newly minted European umbrella might not carry the exact same weight as the American one. Section 4. What America actually loses. Up to this point, we've focused heavily on Europe's struggles. But let's flip the script for a second. What does America actually lose? On paper, leaving saves massive amounts of money and aligns perfectly with the 2026 National Defense Strategy, which pivots focus entirely to the Indo-Pacific. But now, what's really interesting about these locations is that they prove Europe isn't just a defensive charity case, it's the physical infrastructure that allows America to be a global military power. Look at what gets lost. Ramstein in Germany coordinates drone operations against Iran and handles vital satellite relays. Aviano in Italy is the only US fighter base south of the Alps, projecting power straight into the Mediterranean. Rota in Spain manages ballistic missile defense for the Atlantic. Retired US generals have stated quite plainly that losing these specific, irreplaceable bases drops the United States from a global superpower down to a regional one. It's purely logistics.
And those logistics bleed directly into intelligence. By walking away, the US simultaneously loses crucial European signals intelligence and human intelligence networks. These are the exact networks that provide America with its clear picture of Russian naval movements in the Atlantic, complex terrorism networks operating across Africa, and a myriad of emerging threats across Eurasia. Look, American collection tech is phenomenal, absolutely, but it is not complete. Walking away creates massive, undeniable global blind spots that US technology simply cannot fill all by itself.
Section 5. The 2027 Danger Zone.
So everything we've discussed up to this point, the spending, the logistical gaps, the nuclear questions, it all collides in this chilling timeline. Let's map this out and see how this builds. Right in the shadow of the staggering costs of Russia's devastating 5-year war in Ukraine. In 2025, Europe finally starts spending real money. In 2026, the command structures begin to transition. But look closely at 2027. Western intelligence explicitly warns this is the year Russia, having absorbed massive casualties in Ukraine but successfully shifting to a wartime economy, could be ready to directly test NATO's eastern flank. The huge problem here is that Europe's defense spending doesn't match US baseline levels until 2030, and they don't even hit their own Hague Summit readiness targets until 2035. There is a terrifying, highly exposed gap between when Europe is most vulnerable in 2027 and when their defense goals are actually met in 2035.
And the consequences of this timeline are for sure not confined to Europe. The signal sent is entirely global. When allies across the world like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines watch the United States walk away from 31 treaty-bound democracies over a disagreement, they take immediate notice. Japan is already reading the room. They're deploying long-range missiles to their southwestern islands specifically to build an independent strike capacity against China. When your closest allies start quietly building the capacity to operate without you, the entire global security architecture fundamentally shifts. Which leaves us with this heavy, profound question straight from our sources. With a fractured alliance, terrifying capability gaps just years before a projected confrontation, and nations globally scrambling to rearm independently, are we watching the start of World War II all over again? It's a scenario with the absolute most extreme stakes imaginable, and it all hinges on the domino effect of a NATO without the United States. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and I'll catch you next time.